Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now we have reached the portion of Liberty Nation Radio which we entitle Talkin Liberty. It's when we reintroduce our regular contributor, constitutional lawyer, LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, and as we like to call him, or at least me, our guardian of individual liberty, Scott Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you back. Let's talk about the gun control lobby. Gun control advocates were sort of staring down the barrel of a figurative loaded gun, Scott, but have now dodged a bullet in a case decided by the Supreme Court this week.
Tim, the law in question that New Yorkers basically couldn't travel legally with their firearms was so odious to the constitutional rights of the people that the legislature ran back to change the law for fear that a decision would come down from the Supreme Court bolstering gun rights. The gun rights proponents challenged that change and said that they shouldn't be allowed to prosper from gaming the system like that. But the Supreme Court found that the case was indeed moot because of the law change, Tim, and we will get no big Second Amendment case, win or loss, from this court this term.
Oh, those clever leftists, taking the law out of force, making it moot so that they could tell the court, hey, don't waste your time with this silly appeal because we already changed the law. But maybe it's a good thing that they changed the law anyway, Scott.
Well, for that, yes, we can be grateful, Tim.
Yes, okay. All right, fair enough. Let's take a trip overseas, something you and I aren't really allowed to do today. But let's do a virtual trip over to France, which has issued the staggering total of 915,000 lockdown tickets to drivers.
Tim, over $12 million ticketed, and these are for people not having papers. And the reason why I brought the story forward, it's just for somebody who, was born during the Cold War, the specter of European countries demanding papers of their citizens and finding them without them. I just thought it was very frightening. And I think it's always important to remind everybody that the liberty isn't stolen with a sales pitch that it's going to be stolen liberty. It's always for the guise of something good.
Now, you're not sure that this isn't just a scheme to try and balance the unbalanced budget for the country of France? I mean, because 915,000 lockdown tickets, that's a lot of income for the government, Scott.
It's a win-win for them, Tim. They get the power and the money.
Wow, they can have it all. Now, the Supreme Court, we'll go back to them for a moment. They've ruled that Georgia cannot put the law of the state of Georgia behind a paywall.
Yeah, the state of Georgia, Tim, published their laws digitally and in a book that had keynote citations. Basically, these are tools that lawyers use to be able to cross-reference and things like that. And they're often done by states in league with legal publishers, namely LexisNexis is the monster. And the problem is that they don't publish alternate versions. And so if you want to republish those books, Tim, then you have to pay basically the private company. Well, that seemed odious to a number of good government sort of advocates in Georgia, and they sued. And they actually won their case in the lower courts, but they encouraged the Supreme Court to take this case so that there would be a nationwide standard, which is what we have now, that those laws, including the citations, if they are in fact published by the legislature, they are not copyrightable.
So then, if you're in Georgia, you got to pay to know what the law is?
No, you don't have to pay, and not just in Georgia. It means in the United States now, the state can't make people pay for republishing this information.
Well, the whole thing is that a 21st century argument or what? Anyway,
I think what the interesting thing about it, Tim, is what happens when cities and states get in league with private industry to profit from the people. That's sort of to me, that's the interesting factor here. They've partnered with a commercial enterprise.
Now let's move over to the Trump administration, which has threatened, now they haven't taken any action yet, but they publicly threatened to sue states that don't lift pandemic orders. On what basis are they making this threat? And is it something that any individual states should worry about?
Well, General Barr has said, I'm directing each of the U.S. attorneys to be on the lookout for state and local directives that could be violating constitutional rights and civil liberties of individual citizens. Now, given what we've seen, Tim, in terms of discrimination against churchgoers, we have county health officials saying that the sacrament or host is not an essential part of religion, for instance, in one county I know of. There's a lot going on there that I think runs afoul of our constitutionally protected rights. And it's nice to at least to have some lip service paid. It would be better to actually see some suits, I think, come down the pike for some of the more egregious actions. But the funny thing, too, about this story, Tim, I know that you'll appreciate this, is that New York Attorney General Letitia James issued a counter statement basically saying that they're prepared to defend the state's authority against the federal government, by the way, acting. Now, let's recall, this would be the federal government acting to advance individual liberty. And the best part about it was that Ms. James cites the 10th Amendment as a basis for her brushback of the federal power, which is just a hilarious thing for those of us who know that, it's probably the first time she's ever asserted a 10th Amendment.
I was going to say
anything, right?
I think this is probably the first time since like the 1960s that the left has cited the 10th Amendment, which they consider to be all but a dead letter because it gives the states way too much power, according to them. And one more story before we leave, Scott. A Tennessee state board has been accused of violating open meeting laws. This doesn't sound like a terribly sexy story, but I think it is an important one.
This has to do with the Tennessee Bureau of Elections and Campaign Finance and a state representative called Joe Towns, and a civil penalty fine that he was going to have to pay for not filing proper campaign finance reports. Now, that is a relatively minor story, Tim, I think. But this coronavirus lockdown stuff is going to be like the full Employment Act for lawyers, I think, going forward. Because there are all sorts of things like this. And they basically, what they did was the board, instead of following their open meeting laws like they should have, or waiting, they held private Zoom meetings and just reported the outcome. So whether it's school boards or election boards or kids' classrooms with terms of service, I think that this is just the trickle right now before the dam breaks. And as soon as these courts are back open more regularly, Tim, we're going to see, I think, a real tidal wave of all sorts of cases like this.
Yes, all the members of your profession are pretty much salivating at the thought of post-coronavirus litigation. Which areas of the law do you think might be particularly effective for them in trying to get settlements?
Oh, I can only think of the Privacy Act violations with regard to all these teachers using different video sharing services with young children without getting proper, basically releases. That seems to me to be someplace I would look.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, where past is prologue, with our own Mark Angelides. All of them available on demand at LibertyNation.com, where, by the way, you can pick up the LibertyNation.com brand new Roku channel. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week. Same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty. And for heaven's sake, stay healthy. We'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.